I'm Patty O'Malley of the Frederick County Nature Council. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the council, it's a friends group that serves both Fountain Rock and Catoctin Creek Nature Centers. And we do that by providing support and improving the park experience for visitors. This evening's webinar is the first in a new series of quarterly programs being made in connection with Fountain Rock. Our next session will be two parts, with a webinar on April 4th and a separate field trip on April 8th relating to spring wildflowers. And we're hoping that you'll be able to join us for that also. And now to introduce Kerry, who I'm pretty sure knows just about everybody on the webinar. We're very fortunate to have Kerry as our speaker this evening. Kerry is a Maryland naturalist with over 15 years experience studying the flora and fauna of Maryland. She has previously worked for the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and has taught classes for Audubon Naturalist Society's Natural Field Studies program. And for those of you who don't know this, Audubon Naturalist Society is now Nature Forward. They've changed their name. Kerry holds a BS degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Management from Frostburg State University and an MS degree in Biology from West Virginia University. She'll be presenting Weird, Wild, and Wonderful, Exploring Maryland's Biodiversity. And so I'll turn it over to Kerry.
Thank you, Patty. Very thrilled to be here and to be back talking about wildlife and plants and all sorts of cool stuff here in Maryland. So my name again is Kerry Wixted, and I am a volunteer naturalist now, and I work for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, NGO, for my day job, but I still like to volunteer and do education whenever I can. So I was very thrilled when I got the invitation to present tonight. And I'm going to try my best to monitor the chat. So if you have questions that come up along the way, feel free to pop them in the chat. And if I don't get to them during the talk, I'll get to them at the end. So let's start off. I want to quiz you a little bit, and I want to find out, what exactly is biodiversity? So why don't you write in the chat what you think biodiversity is, or what does biodiversity mean to you when you hear that term? And don't feel bad if you don't have a definition. So there have been some studies with the general public, and a lot of people can't define what biodiversity is. So when you hear the word biodiversity, what do you think about? Interdependence of species, maximum number of organisms, preferably alive, number of species in an area, the number and kind of wildlife we have. Yeah. Nuance, similarities, and differences of life in a given ecosystem, the web of life, different kinds of live organisms. Yeah. Web of life. Yeah. Yeah. So you're all, you all have that understanding of what biodiversity is. And biodiversity can be many different things. So the technical terminology or technical definition for biodiversity essentially is the variety of life in a world or in a particular habitat or an ecosystem. So you can look at biodiversity on a small scale, like what's the biodiversity in your own backyard. You can look at it on a regional scale. You can look at it on a national scale or different levels and all of that. You can look at it in just particular ecosystems like marsh habitats or along the Catoctin streams in Western Maryland and places like that. And I like to think of biodiversity as the spice of life, and being a born and bred Marylander, it is our Old Bay that keeps us all together, that we all need in our everyday lives. And biodiversity includes more than just wildlife. It also includes plants, it includes fungi, and all sorts of other living organisms. And so when we think about the biodiversity across Maryland, we actually are really fortunate to have this excellent project, the Maryland Biodiversity Project, that has actually helped quantify the different species that have been documented across the state. So let's one more quiz question for you all. Let's guess how many species have been documented in Maryland. And these are species of plants, of animals, of fungi, those types of things, algae. Throw out some guesses. Give me some numbers of how many species you think we have actually documented in Maryland. So you see 1,250 from Ron, 50K from Sue, 25,000-ish, 3,000, 2,000. There's some big differences in these numbers here. 2,000. Just to give you a little hint, the number of rare, threatened, and endangered species in Maryland is around 1,250 species. So that gives you an idea of how many species we might have. 40,000, a lot of 2,000 there, 10,500. I just had to look at Maryland Biodiversity Project today, and the number right now is over 20,600 species. So that number has increased significantly over the last 10 years. This is their 10th anniversary right now. The number continues to climb. And a lot of that is thanks to naturalists like all of you out in the crowd, people who have been submitting their information and their sightings and helping us to figure out the biodiversity that we have. So Maryland is often called America in miniature, and it's because of all the different amazing habitats that we have across the state. So for those of you who've been to my other presentations, I like to show this picture a lot. And these are all the different physiographic provinces of Maryland. And Maryland's split up into these provinces based on the underlying geology of the different areas, and also some of the microclimatic features that you see. So I'm down in what's known as the coastal plain here in Anne Arundel County. So we're a little warmer than you all are out there in Frederick and other parts of the state. And our soils are a lot younger. So most of our soils in Anne Arundel County are sandy and acidic, or clay from being at the bottom of the ancient oceans. Whereas you have different soils and different climates, so you're going to get some different species as we travel west in the state. What's really fascinating to me, you're traveling all around the world and all across the United States. It's just so cool to see some of these species out in the Appalachian Plateau region that I would also see in places like Maine and in Canada, or to go down to Southern Maryland and also see those species down in Florida, and even sometimes in places like Costa Rica. So just having this variety of climates in these provinces and all of that really gives to all of that biodiversity. So now I'm going to get into some of the different groups of critters, and it's really hard to select out of 20,000 species, like which ones do you feature? So I tried to find a mixture, and I figured I'd start off with some of the just plain weird critters that are out there. And I tried to select ones that maybe you might not be too familiar with. So one of those is the mantid fly, and despite its name, it's not a mantis and it's not a fly. It's actually related to green lacewings. For those of you who are gardeners, probably really familiar with the lacewings because they're good at eating aphids and other soft-bodied pests in the garden. So it does resemble a mantis, and that's because it has these raptorial arms that it uses to grab its prey. But unlike mantids, which are kind of weight and camouflage and ambush type predators, mantid flies are a lot more active with their hunting strategies, but they're pretty goofy at flying. If you can imagine, their bodies are a little off kilter with those giant arms in the front. Interestingly enough, the larvae actually parasitize spider egg sacs. So that's what they feed on as larvae, and then as adults, they fly around and grab other organisms. And they're mostly active at night. So I ran a moth light on the wrong way. Ran a moth light this past summer, and essentially it's just a black light on a white sheet. And this is one that showed up. They have these wild looking eyes when you look at them under black light. So really cool critters. Another weird species that we have is some of our different stinkhorn fungi. So stinkhorn fungi actually smell really bad, and that is to attract flies and insects like beetles to come and land on them. And they pick up those brownish spores that you see there and move the spores around. So instead of passively dropping your spores from the mushroom cap onto the ground or blowing them into the air, they require some type of organism to help with that dispersal. So one of my favorite stinkhorns is the stinky squid. First time I saw it was at Jug Bay in Anne Arundel County, and this picture is actually from Montgomery County. You'll see a lot in mulch because it likes to grow off of decaying wood. And it looks like a bunch of claws coming out of the ground. And if you look really close, you'll see some of that brown, stinky spore stuff that is using to attract those dispersers. In aquatic environments and freshwater aquatic environments, we also have some weird organisms like these freshwater bryozoas. So they're actually an animal-like organism, almost like a freshwater coral, but they're a bunch of single-celled organisms that aggregate into these blobs. They often look like blobby brains kind of floating along in slow-moving waters and streams. You'll find it attached to sometimes docks and on tree roots and branches and all of that. And this is actually the magnificent Pictinella. And this picture is from my undergrad freshwater ecology class. So it was kind of neat finding about these organisms early on in my naturalist career. So cool critters that are out there, and some of them are non-native, but they're not very well studied. So we don't have a good handle of the different species of bryozoans here in Maryland. For those of you that know me, you probably know I have a very big love of spiders. And one of the weirdest spiders that I feel that we have in Maryland, or weirdest groups of spiders, are these bolus spiders. And we're super fortunate to have Bonnie Ott here in the state. She is a naturalist, and she lives and does a lot of her work out in Howard County. And she is one of our local bolus spider experts, which is really awesome. So I've borrowed a couple of her photos here to feature. So bolus spiders are ambush predators. They look like bird poop. So this is a female right here. We have 4 different species, and they resemble bird poop, and they sit all day on leaves. And their webs, they even make their webs kind of look like the uric acid that you'll see in bird poop. So they just sit there all day. And then this time of day or time of night is when they become active, and they create this little bolus. It is a scented strand. It smells like the pheromones of a female moth. And they hang this bolus down below them, and it attracts male moths, which are their prey. So they essentially fish for moths at night. Another wild thing about them is that the males are super tiny. So this little red guy right here, that is a male bolus spider with a full-grown female. And he's actually copulating with her in this instance. So what a wild thing to capture. And this is all because of Bonnie's perseverance to go out and study these wonderful and very understudied creatures. And just recently, she held a bolus spider hike out at Howard County Conservancy. So if you're ever interested, check out the Maryland Biodiversity Project webpage and see whenever Bonnie is leading a hike. She is an excellent guide to learn about some of these cool creatures out there. Moving along to plants, we have over 20 species of carnivorous plants in Maryland. And as you might imagine, they're highly specialized. A lot of them are found in these habitats that are relatively nutrient poor, so they had to turn to eating flesh to be able to get the food to sustain them. Our largest natural carnivorous plant is the northern pitcher plant. There have also been yellow pitcher plants, which have been introduced to parts of the state. And there are some planted populations of this northern pitcher plant. So I'll talk about the northern pitcher plant a little bit more on the next slide, but they have this kind of vase shape. And if you notice all these hairs, they have these downward facing hairs, and essentially organisms like flies and things like that will land on the top of the pitcher and slide on down into the pitcher soup to be slowly digested by the plant. One of the coolest trapping mechanisms that we have in the carnivorous plant world are found in the bladderworts. And this is where the majority of our carnivorous plant species fall here in Maryland. This is swollen bladderwort. It's one of the easier to identify bladderworts when it's flowering, because if you look at the base of this picture, you'll see this kind of wheel that the flower sits on top of when it's in the flowering stage. This is a state rare species, and we've got several other bladderworts that are also found in Maryland. And they have the most sophisticated trapping mechanism in the plant world. It's actually air-filled bladders with trigger hairs. And when a little tiny microscopic organism like a rotifer hits one of those trigger hairs, it vacuums the organism inside, seals it off, and the animal gets digested by the tiny little bladders. So it's a really fast process that happens, and it's very sophisticated trap that these plants employ. Interestingly enough, at least one species of bladderwort seems to be changing its diet. The purple bladderwort, which can also be found in Maryland, has been found to have a lot of algae in its bladders. And some researchers are noting that the plant is actually getting nutrients from the algae in exchange for the algae to have a nice, safe place to stay. So it might be switching its carnivorous diet to becoming more of an omnivore out there in the wild. The last thing I'll say about this plant and all the other carnivorous plants is that they make sure they don't mix business with pleasure. So you'll often see these flowers well above the eating parts of the plant. So they're not inadvertently eating their pollinators. Another example of a passive type of carnivorous plant are the sundews. So they have these sticky glandular hairs that attract insects like flies and damselflies and things of that nature, and then they get stuck to the plant. The plant sometimes can kill an insect in as little as 15 minutes, but it often takes up to 2 weeks to digest an organism fully. So some of these sundews also, they're really tiny plants. Most of them are about the diameter of a quarter here in Maryland. Some of them can live up to 50 years. So they can be really long-lived plants as well. Now, as I said, I was going to talk a little bit more about the northern pitcher plants because they're really fascinating. And they're different from some of the other pitcher plant cousins that you'll find in other parts of the United States here. So the northern pitcher plant has this open pitcher that actually is open to rainwater and gets diluted by rainwater. So the enzymes that are found in the northern pitcher plant aren't as strong as some of its cousins like yellow pitcher plants. This picture is from North Carolina down in the green swamp. And you see that they have hoods over the pitchers, and that keeps some of the rainwater out so it doesn't dilute those enzymes in the pitcher. To make up for the fact that it has these enzymes that aren't as strong as its cousins, it actually has a mini ecosystem inside of the pitcher. And that ecosystem is often being controlled by this pitcher plant mosquito, which is also rare in Maryland. And you're probably thinking, oh, a mosquito, Kerry? But this is actually a nectar feeding mosquito. So it will not feed on you at all. All it does is it lives inside the pitcher plant. It grows inside the pitcher plant, and then once it pupates, then the adults will go and find flowers and things like that to feed off of their nectar instead of blood. So researchers have found that things like the acidity of the pitcher plant pitchers can change the microbial communities, and whether or not you have these pitcher plant mosquito larvae inside those pitcher plants will also change the different microscopic organisms that are found in those pitchers. So it's really fascinating, something we haven't fully unlocked and understand just yet, and something really, interesting to study into the future. Moving along to another weird organism that we have out there, you might be seeing some slime molds with some of our recent rains. So slime molds often get lumped in with fungi, but they're not fungi. They're actually more related to animals than they are to fungi. And slime molds essentially are aggregate plasmodium kinds of organisms. And researchers have found that slime molds can even navigate simple mazes. So they can move around at a sort of glacial pace, and they can work together as a combined organism to solve things like mazes. So this slime mold in particular is often found on rotting wood, and so most people will find it in their mulch beds and things like that. When it's nice and fresh, it looks like scrambled eggs. But once it starts to dry out, you can see why it also is called dog vomit slime mold, because it looks like old dog barf kind of crusted on the mulch there. Interestingly enough, its spores are dispersed by beetles, and researchers have found that it's highly resistant to zinc toxicity, so and other types of metals, which might make it a usable resource in the future. Moving along to some of the wild critters that we have out there, the eastern Hercules beetle is our largest beetle here in the eastern United States. This is my hand for scale. A couple years ago down in Arnold, Maryland, when I found my first and only living male, but it was so wild to me. And then this past summer, while I was doing my moth flights, I actually had a female show up at my house, which just like took the cake of everything that I found at my house this summer. So these organisms, their diet actually isn't very well known, but they're often associated with rotting wood and things like that. The males have these really large horns, and if you look at this male right here, you can see this one's broken off, and they essentially have these large horns for fighting and dominance displays. You'll find the larvae, they live in rotting wood, and they can be found in the soil and everything, and they're just big plump grubs. They take sometimes over a year to develop in the soil or in rotting wood until they're able to emerge as these adults. We also have lots of wasp species around, and the largest wasp species that we have in Maryland is the giant ichneumon wasp. And they are parasites. They're actually parasites of parasites, or hyperparasites. And this is one that I took a picture of when I was dating my husband. And I remember that day vividly because I had just met some of his friends. And we went down to the beach by our house. And this female was actually taking her ovipositor, which is her modified stinger there. And she was laying eggs in the wood, the rotten wood of the picnic table. And I was like, this is so amazing. And I'm like, look at you, gorgeous. And I'm talking to her and taking all of her pictures. And my now husband's friends were staring at me and staring at him like, who is this person you're dating now? They were just questioning my sanity, thinking that this giant wasp was awesome. Especially because the ovipositor is a good like 4 to 5 inches in length. And even though it's really big, they can't sting you. So they use that giant ovipositor to probe into rotting wood to find what they're really looking for, which is this primitive wasp called the pigeon tremix right here. This is a type of wood wasp. And they live in rotting wood. So the giant ichneumon will lay its eggs directly on the pigeon tremix. The larvae will hatch and they will eat the pigeon tremix alive. So not a very fun way to go, but it is how nature keeps those checks and balances out there. The giant ichneumonids stinger also has like the tip of it is almost like a steel-tipped drill to be able to get into that rotting wood. So really, really fascinating relationship there. But not to worry unless you're a pigeon tremix. We also have some really gorgeous fish here in Maryland. This is by far what I think is the prettiest fish that we have here in Maryland. And as you go a little bit further west, West Virginia does have some amazing darter diversity because of some of the glaciation that happened and all of that. Or really, the geographic divisions between like West Virginia and Maryland that allowed for some of the speciation to occur should kind of qualify that. So the rainbow darter, as its name suggests, is rainbow colored. In the breeding season, the males are brilliant looking. So these are amazing photos by Emilio Concari. He is a local naturalist and he takes amazing photos, and he got them in the prettiest looks here. So these species, while they're really brightly colored, often aren't seen by most people. And that's because they live in these really fast moving streams in those rifle habitats that we have in places like Western Maryland. So you find them in Frederick and in points west there. These darters are in the perch families. They're related to things like yellow perches and all of that. They're small. Most of our darter species here in Maryland are pretty small, and they spend most of their time on the ground. So on the ground of the stream. So that's why they kind of have a flat belly and those fins out off to the side to be able to kind of sit on the bottom. And they're insectivorous, so they're out there eating macroinvertebrates along in those ripple habitats and all of that. The rainbow darter, as you might imagine, is extremely sensitive to pollution. So any type of pollution or contaminants in the water can significantly disrupt this species. And at one time, we had an endemic darter species in Maryland. It was called the Maryland darter. It's only been known from out in the Elk River drainage in the eastern part of the state. But I believe that species has been considered to be extirpated or close to it. So while the rainbow darter spends most of its time in fast-moving water, during breeding time, you might be able to catch a glimpse of it because it will go to slower moving puddles and sections of the stream to breed. And they have group spawning where males will come in and fertilize eggs from multiple females in a big kind of group frenzy there. And another cool group of organisms that we have in Maryland are freshwater mussels. And freshwater mussels are arguably some of the most imperiled species in the world. And some of that is due to the fact they can't move very far. They're very sensitive to water pollution. And a lot of them have very specialized life cycles. For example, this one that I'm going to show you a video of right here. So this is a mussel. And while this looks like a fish right here, this is actually part of the freshwater mussel. And what they do is essentially they attract predatory fish like bass to come and try to eat what they think is a small fish. But all of that stuff that you just got seen get splurted out from the mussel, that is actually all the spawn from the mussel. Because some of these mussels require their larvae to attach to the gills of particular fish species to be able to complete the first stage of their life cycle. So if you have dams or other things that are blocking the movement of particular fish species, you're automatically going to be blocking the dispersal and the reproduction of some of these mussels. So a very specialized relationship between some of these mussels and fish. Now, not all of them have larvae that attach to the gills of fish. Some of them can just have that free swimming larvae and things like that. Some of them are specific to the species of fish that the gills that they have to attach to, and some of them will just attach to any old fish that wanders by. It really depends on the different types of mussels that we have. And one person who's doing a lot of mussel research here in Maryland is Jorge Montero, Bogantes Montero with the Anacostia Watershed Society. They're doing a lot of reintroductions of freshwater mussels in the Anacostia. And certainly folks with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources are doing a lot of work with freshwater mussels too. And in some of these high quality streams out in Western Maryland, you'll also have our largest salamander of North America, and that is the hellbender. They can reach up lengths of almost 3 feet in length, and they're found in the Appalachian region in particular. And so there are very few spots that these species are left in Maryland. Most of the high quality populations are out in West Virginia and Virginia. But their other name is snot otter, and I can personally attest to why they're called that. This is my hand right here with one that I was fortunate with meeting in West Virginia when I did fish studies. And they are super slimy. So if you've ever touched an eel, they are slimier than an eel. And they have that nice slimy protective outer covering essentially to help them with their bodies in these aquatic habitats. So these are fully aquatic salamanders. They have these amazing gular folds along their body that help them with electrical detections of organisms in the water, and also just helps them with oxygen exchange as well. They have, you'll notice a lot of bumps and pits towards their face because they have a lot of that sensory organ towards their face. Their eyes aren't the best at seeing. It's all about using their skin and those bumps and all of that to detect the environment around them. But they have these little toes that helps grip on to things like rocks and stuff as they're crawling along the stream and everything. And they have really unique reproduction. The males actually will guard the eggs and the young. So the males essentially find nest spots, attract the females will lay the eggs, he'll fertilize them, and he'll take care of them for a bit. So they provide a degree of paternal care. Unfortunately, these species are declining, much like the rainbow darters, just because of things like pollution in the water, but also non-native organisms like crayfish and some of the non-native trout and larger predatory fish might have some impacts on the younger stages of their life cycle, on the egg and juvenile stages. So still trying to figure some of that out. And some states like Missouri just celebrated head starting their 1,000th hellbender into the wild. So some states have some really intense breeding and reintroduction programs happening. Moving along to some lovely Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera are the collective term for butterflies and moths. There's lots of these different species out there, and most of the time butterflies get all of the praise, but we've got some really gorgeous and fascinating moths as well. One of my favorite moth species here in Maryland is actually the rosy maple moth. And the first time I saw one, it was when I was in grad school. I was studying invasive plants in grad school. I was out planting ginseng and garlic mustard together for my experiments. And a rosy maple moth must have just eclosed because it fell right down next to me while I was sitting there planting ginseng. And I had this like dilemma because I'm looking at this gorgeous bright yellow and pink moth, something that I'd never seen before. Of course, this was before having smartphones and iNaturalist, so I had no idea what I was looking at. And I had this like dilemma. I was like, this thing is too pretty to be native. Like, this looks like it's tropical. It's probably like some horribly invasive thing. And if I let it live, then I might be like unleashing the next invasive species onto the environment. So I had this like discussion with myself out in the field of whether or not I should leave it alone or squish it or do something. And ultimately I decided to leave it alone. I did take some pictures of it and I came back and I was just so thrilled to find out that it was native. And I did the right thing by not eliminating the animal just because it looked weird to me. So now they are regular visitors to my house every year because, as their name suggests, they do feed on maple trees. Their caterpillars host on maples as well as other plants. So I have lots of maples and they have lots of food. So really nice relationship there. We also have some pretty wild of Lepidoptera species. One of the coolest, I think, is Harris's three-spot. And Bonnie Ott, who I mentioned earlier with the bolus spiders, she actually showed me my first Harris's three-spot caterpillar this past fall. And this caterpillar is wild looking. So just like look at it. When it is in its early instars, it rears up and it tries to act like a jumping spider. And it uses its legs to kind of like maneuver itself to make it look like the fangs or the chelicerae of a jumping spider, to look like it's all scary. And then as it molts, as it goes through the different instars, it actually takes the discarded skin from around its head and makes skin hats. So this one is on its third instar because it's got two other hats here. And each time it just adds another hat to the collection. So it's just kind of wild how they adapted to have these weird skin hats and all of that. If you get too close, they also thrash around vigorously to make themselves seem super, super scary to any potential predators. Another one of our beautiful moth species that we have, this is a relative of the Luna moth. It's in the silk moth family. This is the Promethea moth. And this is a male that I got to watch eclose in Virginia a couple years ago. The males have these larger antennae here, and they are just so, so pretty. So they're going to overwinter in these cocoons that are attached to whatever they host on, usually things like spice bush and plants like that. And their cocoons just look like a bunch of dried up leaves hanging down. And I caught this one right in May a few years ago as it was coming out, and I was able to take some pictures of it. But a really, really pretty, large, several inch wingspan type of moth that you will find around. In the wild category, we also have some wild mammals. One of my favorite mammals that I like to talk about that you probably have in your backyard are these short-tailed shrews. They are 4 to 5 inches of fury. They have amazing heartbeats. Their heart beats anywhere from 800 to 1,000 times a minute. Super, super active. They have to eat every 2 to 3 hours or they die. That's how fast their metabolism is. Super tiny eyes, super pointed noses, so they're almost blind. Spend most of their time underground, and they use their nose and a primitive form of echolocation to get around. So really excellent sense of smell and that echolocation that they can do. They are called short-tailed shrews because unlike their cousins, they have these little short tails. Looks like somebody cut them off. And they are the largest of our shrews here in Maryland, coming in a whopping 4 to 5 inches with their tails. Most of our other shrews are about 2 to 3 inches. So pretty tiny organisms. And the other cool thing about the short-tailed shrews in particular is they have venom in their saliva. They're our only venomous mammal here in North America. So the venom's a neurotoxin. It can take down like several hundred mice. They can give you a pretty nasty bite, but it's not potent enough to be a neurotoxin against humans or domestic pets, because sometimes dogs and things like that will grab them. They can deliver a nasty bite, but it's nothing to worry about long term. Just leave them to let them do their thing. And I just saw one a few days ago. So sometimes if you sit really quiet in the forest and in an area that has a lot of leaves, you might hear something rustling along the leaves. And if you sit and wait and look, you might see one of them pop out, but they never stop moving. They are always, always moving because they've always got to go and eat food. The last wild organism we're going to talk about till I get to the wonderful are these slave-making ants. And the fancy science term is called dulosis. But essentially they're slave-raiding ants. So you've got these there are different species of slave-making ants, but you have the slave masters that go in and typically raid other ants' nests. They take the young and they raise the young as slaves to tend to the slave masters' babies, essentially. So they make them do all the work in the nurseries and help with cleaning and foraging and all of that in the ant nest. So wildly enough, some of them are obligate. So that means that some of these slave-making ants go after particular species of slave ants. And some of them are facultative. So essentially, whatever other ants are out there, they'll go and raid the nest and they'll raise those smaller ant species as their slaves. So interestingly enough, I met researchers from Germany once, and this is where I learned about this whole crazy relationship in the ant world. And they were studying how sometimes the slaves revolt. So sometimes the slave ant species will actually revolt. They got footage of the slaves ripping apart the young and the pupae of the slave masters and just destroying the nest of their captors, which was just wild, because I never thought of ants having such complex social interactions until I learned about this. I got to see some of it, and it's all happening at a micro scale below our feet that we might not even realize that it's there. There's been a lot of research into the evolution of this social relationship, and it seems like these slave-making ants started out as nest parasites first, and then later evolved those tendencies to kind of raid the nest and take the other ants for their own. So might be happening in your own backyard, and you might not even realize it. Last group I'm going to talk about are the wonderful, and I have to add some big mammals in here. A lot of people are very, they don't realize that we have fishers in Maryland. These are large weasels. So weasels, otters are large weasels and things like that. So the fishers spend their time on land. They're mostly up on in trees, so they're considered an arboreal species. And they can get up to 2.5 feet in length. So they are voracious predators as well. They can take down very large prey, and one of their special prey items are porcupines. So fishers are mean enough to go after a prickly porcupine, and usually they go in and bite the face or flip them over and grab kind of the soft underbelly of the porcupine to be able to subdue them. And with the, for a long time, porcupine populations were way down in Maryland. They were considered to be state listed species or track species. And now they're just, I think, a watch list species. So uncommon, but doing better. And with the expansion of the porcupines, or the comeback of the porcupines, we are also seeing a comeback of the fishers. And part of this is also related to the fact that our forests are starting to get older, because our fishers like old age forests to live within, to be able to support them. So a couple myths about fishers. Sometimes they're called fisher cats. And that's probably because of a relative over in Europe that the colonists kind of mistook for their European cousin, but they're not cats, they're weasels. And the other thing is that a lot of people believe that fishers scream. And you hear weird screams in the night, and those are the screams of the fisher cats. What you are actually hearing are the screams of red foxes, because fishers are relatively quiet and they do not scream. So you really won't be hearing fishers out in the woods out there. Keep your distance from them if you ever see them. They can be quite formidable predators. I had a friend who had pictures of one that had taken down a fawn and was swimming across the stream with a whole fawn in its mouth. So they are pretty big and good at eating. So another thing I just want to talk about, I've been highlighting a lot of really rare and unique species and tried to select some flashy ones. And I got a fringed orchid here as one of those flashy species, but sometimes beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And there are a lot of species you might just walk by, but they're like extremely fascinating. I mean, we do have over 50 species of orchids in Maryland. Most of them are small and nondescript, but we do have some of these showy species like these fringed orchids, which you'll see out in the Frederick City watershed and places like that. So they're cool, but we've got a lot of other cool plants too that have really unique life cycles, like our parasitic plants. One of them is bearcorn. This is a really common plant that you will find in oak forests. And they don't have chlorophyll because they're parasites. They parasitize oaks, particularly red oaks and white oaks. And they essentially, tap into oak roots and steal nutrients and water from the oaks. And interestingly enough, the oaks slowly poison them over time. So a lot of bearcorn doesn't live past 10 years, and that can be due to the slow poison of the tannins that oaks are dispersing along with the nutrients into this parasite. So I actually caught this one sort of in bloom. You can kind of see the flowers, not very showy. They certainly don't provide any nectar, and they don't really have a scent. So they're not very good at attracting pollinators, but it's believed that some bumblebees get duped into visiting bearcorn and pollinating them. Most of the time, bearcorn clones itself. So it is a self-fertilizing species, and it will clone itself. And it's called bearcorn because, as you might imagine, bears do like to eat it. And you will find the seeds in bear poop from time to time. So don't know if it has a lot of nutrition for anything else, but bears eat whatever they can, especially this time of year. Another plant that you might walk by a lot that you might not really give a second glance is probably skunk cabbage. And I have to thank Siobhan Percy for really falling in love with skunk cabbage. She does a skunk cabbage swamp stomp. No, you're not stomping on skunk cabbage, but you're learning about the beauty of skunk cabbage. Really fascinating plant. It uses thermogenesis, or an enzyme reaction, to heat up snow and the environment around it to make itself warm and inviting for pollinators in the early spring when it's flowering. It's one of our earliest flowering native plants that we have. And it has male and female flowers on the same plant, but they come out at different times to prevent self-fertilization. In addition to that thermogenesis, it has a lot of, I think it's oxalic acid crystals in it. So it isn't really eaten by a lot of organisms because it kind of tastes like burning. You can eat it if you boil it in like new water like 5 or 6 times, and apparently it just tastes like cabbage. So it's not really a nutritious or enticing food. But there is one animal that loves skunk cabbage in the spring, and that is our black bears. And part of the reason why it likes to eat skunk cabbage is because they haven't pooped in a very long time when they emerge in the spring. So they eat skunk cabbage as a laxative to help them get rid of that plug that has formed in their bodies after not going to the bathroom from essentially December through March. So I don't think skunk cabbage has a laxative effects on a human, but you know, don't go out and try it. Leave it to the bears. Moving along to another wasp group that I think is fascinating. These are the cuckoo wasp, and they are literally the jewels of the wasp world. So these are, you know, this is a species, this was a picture taken in Baltimore County. And this is another species that we have. So these chrysalids are just gorgeous. And some of the researchers working with them don't understand why they're so colorful, but it could actually be to distract and throw off other wasp species that they parasitize, because they're nest parasites. So what they do is they find other wasp species going to build their burrows and dens and provisioning them with food for their young, and the cuckoo wasp will sneak in there, lay their eggs, and bounce, and essentially let somebody else kind of feed and care for their young. So their defense mechanism is to curl up into a ball like this. They've got a really hard exoskeleton there. So if they get found out by the wasp that they're parasitizing, curl up in a protective ball and try to protect themselves from being stung and stabbed by that angry wasp that might have discovered their treachery. So really, really cool organisms. And most of them are like super tiny. So they're like, you know, less than a half an inch in length. You might have them around and not even realize that they're out there. So if you ever see a thing that looks like a bee, but it's almost jewel colored and metallic and super shiny, it might actually be a cuckoo wasp. So had to throw in a snake too. This isn't a snake you're going to find in Frederick, but this is a snake that you'll find out in Southern Maryland. And this is what I think is our prettiest snake, the rainbow snake. This is also a species that's endangered in Maryland. And one of the reasons why it's endangered is because of its specialized habitat and life cycle needs. And I have this I Heart Eels picture here. That is because their primary food are eels. And so just like with the freshwater mussels, those dams that limit dispersal of fish affect the reproduction and life cycles of those mussels. Well, those dams are also affecting the movement of freshwater eels into different environments. And that has a direct impact on eel predators like rainbow snakes. So only a handful of rainbow snakes have been found in Maryland in the last 20 or so years. They're extremely secretive. They live in wetland environments. And most of them have been found after like strong, heavy rains in the spring and summer on the road. So just trying to cross roads to get from wetland habitat to wetland habitat. And that can be problematic because they can also be hit by cars and things like that. Another thing that's really affecting our rainbow snakes, and I don't know if it's a big problem for rainbow snakes in Maryland, but I did go to a talk on ones in Virginia. There's a disease called snake fungal disease, and you might see some gnarly looking snakes where they've got a lot of like lesions and problems like around their face and damage to their scales and all of that. It seems like in Virginia, some of the rainbow snakes are highly susceptible to snake fungal disease. And there's a lot of research going on whether or not snake fungal disease is endemic to North America or if it's been introduced if it is truly fatal or if there are secondary factors that are causing the death and mortality with these snakes. But we do know here in Maryland, water snakes are definitely a species that you see snake fungal disease in a lot. And I see a question from Joseph O'Connor about fish ladders on dams in Maryland. And I believe there are some fish ladders, and there has been some work lately to remove some of the dams. Like they just removed the big one at Patapsco State Park several years ago. So there is a lot of that work being done. And certainly with the infrastructure bill that just got passed, there's a lot of infrastructure funds that also will help with some of those dam removal projects coming into the future, or putting in things like fish ladders to help with the migration and movement of these different fish species. So I can't end my presentation without talking about at least one bird species. And I figure since I've got my owl crew here online, they actually might be checking the nets right now, but gotta give a shout out to the northern saw-whet owl, which is our smallest owl here in the eastern North America and is one of our migratory species. And in this picture, this is Melissa Boyle-Cootie. She is our station manager for the project, our Project Owlnet station down in Smithsonian in southern Anne Arundel County. So this is where I would be tonight if I were not speaking with all of you, trying to attract these owls, catch them with permits, and give them bands and take different measurements to learn about the movement and migration and different factors concerning these owls. So these are our smallest owls. You can see that amazing disc-shaped face, good predators eating mice and voles and other types of small organisms. And some of the work that we do is we collect data on physical characteristics of the owls. We age them by looking at their flight feathers under a black light. So I see from Melissa, they've already got one on their first net check tonight. So the feathers in owls have this protein called porphyrin, and it fluoresces hot pink when brand new feathers. And if you were to look at a wing of an owl and all of the feathers were hot pink, that tells you all those feathers are the same age, which would make it a first year or hatch year bird. If you see different patterns of white and pink feathers, like you can see on this picture here, you've got pink, you've got white, which is old, pink, old, and all of that. You see those different blocks. You can actually age the bird as either a second year or we call after second year ASY for older birds and all of that. So we're aging the birds that are coming through the stations. We're adding little bands to their feet to show where they got banded at. If we capture somebody else's bird, one that had been banded at a previous station, we submit that data. And Melissa was fortunate to capture a bird that had been banded in Canada several years ago. So that was really cool data to have. We help collect data on the sex of the birds and other characteristics. Like this year, we're taking photos of their faces to help with the graduate project to do some imaging of the birds, to do some sexing with reverse images of their faces and a few other things. So lots of cool stuff going on with these birds, and we'll be continuing this in Maryland through Thanksgiving. And one thing about these saw-whet owls, one thing we found that there are certain years that are heavier years than others. And I just want to use the owl as an example of essentially owls are made of trees. And sometimes we look at these charismatic large organisms like owls and we just think, oh, I've got to save the owls. But you can't save the owls if you don't respect the fact the owls eat rodents, right? If you're poisoning the rodents, the mice and the voles and getting rid of them in the habitat, you're going to have a direct impact on those owls. And we wouldn't have those mice and voles and other things if we didn't have trees. So the big years that we have with these saw-whet owls migrating through our area, it all stems back to big years for pine cone production, which feed a lot of mice, which feed a lot of baby owls, and those owls come south. So it's really, I've talked about a lot of individual organisms, but I hope one of the things that you walk away with is the fact that nature is heavily, heavily interconnected. And we can't just focus on managing a single species or saving a single species. You have to think about all the other organisms in that web. So I've talked about a lot of cool things tonight, and one of the ways to go out and find some of these really cool things is first learning how to see, because there's a lot of things that you might just miss. And that's just because we're so busy. We don't always stop and sit there and listen to for the leaves to start rustling as the short-tailed shrew pops out, or look for the ants that are working really hard at the tree over in the corner. So spend some time connecting to nature, listening, and just spending some quiet time outside, and you'll see so much when you just stop and pause for a bit. And you can also check out some of these sites. This is a project that's 10 years old this year. This is the Maryland Natural Areas Project, where we identified 31 really cool places to visit in Maryland. And there's this map on the Maryland DNR website where you can go and you can click on all of these spots, and it will take you to a page that talks about some of these really fascinating sites and the species that are found within them. So all of these sites are open to the public either year-round or parts of the year, and it talks about some of the conservation successes at the sites, who is responsible for managing those areas. So some of these are state parks, some of them are county parks, some of them are properties of the Nature Conservancy or other organizations that are helping to protect that property. So I highly encourage you to check out the site and learn about some of these really cool places to visit, so you can see some of these really cool organisms. And certainly a lot of these species are threatened in many different ways. We've got habitat degradation and loss happening. So this is right by my house, Severn Run natural area, highly affected by stormwater runoff. So all the runoff from heavy rainstorms comes down and just, completely scours these environments, riparian areas along the waterways. We've got invasive species. So cats, outdoor cats, those are invasive. They're eating lots of things. They're eating birds, they're eating bats, they're eating different types of reptiles and amphibians, and they're also spreading diseases. We've got invasive plants that people are planting in their yard or releasing from their aquariums or unintentionally moving around with gear and things like that. We certainly have a lot of pollution. And I write this thing down, apathy, because I found this a lot. When you're not talking about charismatic animals like the owls, or really pretty organisms like monarch butterflies, sometimes people just don't seem to care about the little things that help run the world. Like, why would I care about a snake that's attached to the glue trap? Well, that snake this is a juvenile rat snake that was brought in when I worked at DNR. We were able to free it. And it was on this glue trap because it wanted to eat those camel crickets. It really wanted to eat those camel crickets to get them out of that basement. And the snake would have done the job. And if it were able to age up, it would have helped with any rodent problems in that area. So sometimes you just have to let nature do its thing and appreciate those different types of organisms as well. And one thing to really keep in mind, and this is something that's really big at the level that I'm working at now, is this idea of One Health, that our health is tied to environmental health and it's tied to animal health. And we have to stop looking at these things as being separate, right? It's not just about saving different types of species. It's also about the environment for us, because healthy habitats that support wildlife, that support plants and high biodiversity are also going to be resilient and adapted to withstanding things like climate change, to helping with air pollution, to all sorts of other things as well. And I always like to quote E.O. Wilson about looking closely at nature and looking at essentially the masterpieces that are out there, and appreciating. What I loved about E.O. Wilson is he appreciated the beauty in small things like ants, right? And he just stopped and spent time looking at them and, finding the beauty in all the little things that run the world. And I hope that that's something that you also take away tonight. Don't like to leave things off with thinking, sad thoughts and all of that. There are a lot of things you can do. And this is one of the reasons why I still volunteer my time after hours to give talks like this and take kids out and do nature programming and all of that, because I highly believe in the importance of community and educating others. And I hope that each and every one of you go out from tonight's presentation and just find somebody else to talk to. And like, oh my gosh, we've got this short-tailed shrew in our backyard and it's like got venom and it's echolocating, or talking about maybe some of the other things that you might have learned. Think about how your individual actions can spur collective actions. So last year I did a bat walk in my community and dressed up like a bat, and we learned all about bats. And it was just a fun way to connect my community to our local bat species and bust myths about bats that are out there. When you're thinking about organisms, you can think about habitat, but not handouts. So planting native species and learning how to coexist with our wildlife, but not intentionally feeding them. Feeding things like raccoons and foxes cause problems, and it gets animals to congregate, and it usually ends up bad for that animal. Unfortunately, from my many years of working with wildlife always lose in the end. So giving them the habitat and not those handouts, that's really going to support them. Making science-based management decisions and supporting those are also really, really important. So just recently, Maryland just wrapped up their annual black bear hunt. And there's a lot of bad press around the black bear hunt, but that is a hunt that has been decided with years of scientific data to help slow the growth of the black bear population. It's heavily controlled and heavily managed. And by no means do they want to extirpate black bears from Maryland. They want to keep the balance between people and wildlife. And so these are decisions that are being made by the Department of Natural Resources and highly trained field biologists that are doing this. And sometimes they just need to, it's their expertise and what they're studying and the data. They've got all of these reasons for why they're doing certain things. And sometimes it just takes talking to them to learn a little bit more. In your own lives, think about making informed decisions with keeping wildlife wild. When you're sharing locations of some of these species like turtles online, you can be inadvertently sharing those locations with people like poachers who might be going out to find them and take them from the wild. Think about pesticides, and right now in the midterms, we're also thinking about voting. And one of the big things that is on the precipice of being passed right now is Recovering America's Wildlife Act, or RAWA. It passed the House this past summer, and right now it is waiting to go to the floor with the Senate. If it were to pass, it would provide $1.3 billion each year for wildlife conservation, specifically to state wildlife agencies like the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and specifically to manage for species of greatest conservation need, which include most of the species that I highlighted tonight. So check out ournatureusa.com. There's going to be a lot of movement with this happening in the next 4 to 5 weeks. And the guidelines for how Maryland's going to spend that money is actually outlined in the Maryland State Wildlife Action Plan, which is all online. So you can go and check that out as well. There's lots of different places that you can learn more about wildlife. Certainly Department of Natural Resources or partners like Maryland Biodiversity Project. The Nature Council mentioned Audubon Naturalist Society is now nature forward. So they're a place that they have a lot of classes. I help teach a mammal class and sometimes an invasive plant class for them. So we're really fortunate to have a lot of amazing organizations here that help support learning and support wildlife and biodiversity here in the state. But I really want to thank the Frederick Nature Council for this invitation to have me come and speak about the different biodiversity we have. So hopefully you learned some new species or cool facts to pass along and share. So remember, educating with the community, that's what we all want to do, right? So.
And Kerry, thank you for such an interesting presentation. I always get a whole lot out of it. I'm sure everybody else does too.
Yeah, plus your enthusiasm for the topic is also makes it special.
I'm just a giant nature nerd, so.
Okay, if there's nothing else, please keep April 4th and 8th on your calendar for our next series, and have a good night. Thank you.
Good night,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thanks, Carrie.